Now, I want to expand on this idea and those dimensions that were mentioned about sayings, doings, and writings, for example, by saying that practices happen in 3 dimensions of intersubjective space. We meet one another in intersubjective space. And this idea of intersubjective space is a space where the individual and the collective come together in a dialectic that Anna Stetsenko describes as the collective vigil. So individuals are always changing in relation to their circumstances, as Marx said in the 3rd thesis on Feuerbach, but the collective also evolves in local and wider traditions. And those things change in relation to one another. As Marx memorably said in 1852, people make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. How I wish I'd said that. Anyway, these spaces of the individual and the collective interconnect. And so when person 1 and their relationships with the collectivities that they're part of meets person 2 and those ones, they can enter a shared intersubjective space. And here are some of the people here, and we are meeting one another now in intersubjective space. And so we are not just existing as individual participants, sort of standing by here. We're also entering this shared intersubjective space. And I think this space is composed of, has 3 dimensions to it. So here are some people who are meeting one another. They encounter one another in language and specialist discourses. And the things that support their language are cultural discursive arrangements. So you ask yourself, what do you hear going on here in this meeting? We also encounter one another in physical space-time in the medium of activity and work among material economic arrangements. So these people are very familiar. They've got their pieces of paper and their folders and their pens, and they're listening to one another. But I ask you, what's that pepper pot doing on the table in front of them? What does that tell us about where they're meeting and how they're meeting? And finally, people encounter one another in social space, in the dimensions of solidarity, belonging, love, friendship, and power, power over and power with. Among social political arrangements like teacher-student role relationships or life-world relationships by which people know one another and come to recognize and understand one another as human individual people, unique like ourselves. So now I'm just going to quickly compose the theory of practice architectures in a sort of schema that I use. So there are these 3 dimensions. We encounter one another as interlocutors in the semantic space, as embodied persons in physical space-time, and as social beings, social space. And in the first dimension are our sayings, the second, our doings, the third, our relatings. And those things are held together, bundled together in the purposes, the projects of our practices. And they're also held together in the agency and dispositions of those who are doing the acting, the practice, enabled by their situated knowledge, knowing how to say and do and relate in this practice. And here are the arrangements, again, in which we meet one another. And they're bundled together in characteristic ways in sites, in practice landscapes where other practices are going on in the school besides the teaching, and in practice traditions where this school is practicing a conservative form of education and that one is practicing a more progressive form or whatever. But all practice traditions, including the practices of educational action research, are conducted within practice traditions. Now, the point of using this theory is to say what composes practices and what's needed if we want to change them. So changing practices required changing the practice architectures that hold them in place, and changing practice architectures requires changing those arrangements, but people can change some, but not all of the arrangements in their sites through their own practices. So how do we change the arrangements with which we meet one another? Here is a fine example of a practice, the tango. In this picture, we see men in Buenos Aires dancing and playing the tango about 1900. And those men are dancing with other men because they're practicing to get good enough to actually dance with women. And you can see that the music is being played by the bandoneon, which is very characteristic of tango music. So the tango has evolved through many, many stages, of which these are three early ones. And I won't say anything about them, just to say that the styles of the tango keep changing. And so the tango is a practice, a global practice, practiced everywhere around the world, keeps changing and developing in relation to local circumstances, as well as the traditions of the tango more generally. So here are some people dancing the tango. And if we want to change what they're doing, in fact, we have to change more than what those dancers do. We have to change what that musician does. We have to change the music. We have to change the content of the songs in tango. We might want to change the kinds of clothing that are worn by people in the tango. There's a very interesting evolution going on in the last 20 years of gay and lesbian tango with same-sex partners. And it's taken a while for this to be accepted, but it's now widely accepted as a new form of the tango. So in order to change the tango, we have to change the places where the tango is danced. We have to change the music that it's danced to. We have to change the costumes of the people who dance it and the way they portray what it is to be in the tango. And the reason I use this example is just to say all practices in schools, practices in universities, have to change by having these practice architectures change also. Here's one thing that you already know, is the action research spiral. I won't spend any time on that. So when you're thinking about the action research spiral, planning, acting, reserving, and reflecting, you're trying to plan on both sides, the practices and the practice architectures, and change those. And I just want to talk briefly about learning as coming to practice differently. I think what we learn arises from, represents, recalls, anticipates, and returns to its use in practice. Learning is a process of coming to practice differently. And I just want to give you a sense of how practices are reproduced with variation in order to be transformed. It's coming from an example of how academics learn to teach from home in the time of the coronavirus pandemic. By the way, I'll give, Maureen has these slides as a PDF, and I'm perfectly happy for her to distribute them to everybody who's here. So here are some of the examples of sayings about teaching in the university at the beginning, people talked about things like lectures and tutorials and so on, and their discourses were framed by assumptions about teaching and learning in university spaces. But after the coronavirus began and we had to teach from home, people began to talk about Zoom, learning management systems, asynchronous learning, and so on. And the discourses of university education, higher education, was reframed in terms of teachers and students' homes as spaces and places for teaching and learning. What was done in learning in universities changed from, e.g., lecturing in lecture theatres to teaching and learning online synchronously as well as asynchronously. And the relatings changed. And one of the things that was most interesting in the study that these examples come from is that while in the beginning there was a strong sense of the formal relationships between teachers and students, as teachers went into the homes and bedrooms of their students and saw the difficulties that their students were facing, they became very much more concerned about the health and well-being of the students they were teaching, and it changed the way they related to them. So the projects, what they intended to do in the practices, changed from one sort of formal activity to another that involved much more intensified care and emerging traditions of more dialogical pedagogy, including humane concern for students' circumstances. And finally, different kinds of situated knowing were required for teaching in the university from teaching at home. And people learning to do that, to teach from home, began to think very differently about what it was that they were doing. So people learned to practice differently among different practice architectures. They shifted from time one to time two. The book's about some of those things. I won't go back there. And I don't think we've got time to do that. So I'll leave it after that half hour and leave you with those questions for breakout rooms